Hello and welcome. I am that James guy, and today we are looking at the latest dev diary for Hearts of Iron 4, the one in which I have been vindicated. They have confirmed what I predicted all along, that a tank designer is in fact on the way. But first, I must make a public service announcement and an apology. And my apology is thus. I promised in my first video in this series that I would do one for every dev diary. Unfortunately, I did not do one last week, for two very good reasons. Firstly, I came up with an absolutely cracking title for the video, and secondly, I came up with absolutely nothing to put in the video of meaningful purpose or use, so decided not to do it. For those of you wondering, the title of the video was going to be How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and you will see my glorious pun come up on screen and hopefully swiftly disappear if my editing skills are anything. So, without further ado, let's crack on for what you're all here for, and that is presumably my thoughts on the tank designer. So let's crack on, shall we? So here we are, and I'm going to be looking at 5 things, roughly, that I have, two of them blend together a little bit, 5 things that I've noticed in this dev diary and predictions that I've sort of drawn and conclusions that I've come to based on the information within. Now, as usual, there is a link downstairs to the dev diary where you can read through this massive wall of text and draw your own conclusions. But the first thing I'd like to talk about is the increased cost of tanks. And in our previous video, we did discuss, or in one of my previous videos, I should say, we did discuss that the increased sort of supply consumption and the supply throughput problems will mean, amongst other things, the death of the 40 width Mater. And I think the increased cost of tanks is very indicative of that direction of travel that Paradox are taking us. If we take this tank here, for example, and we're going to ignore the components for now, I'm going to talk a bit more about those later on when I discuss the other things, but we can see it's going to cost 12. Supply use has been handily blocked out, but production cost of 12. And we can see down here this improved light tank destroyer, production cost of 13.2, and again, no supply cost. If we just take a look at the stats, and we know improved light tank chassis, based on this here, is going to presumably be the 1936 model, not the 1934 model. As we know, there is a basic light tank chassis. We can take that price and go, okay, then 1936 a light tank, that costs 13.2. If we just load in very quickly, I don't know, New Zealand, played them in multiplayer today, really fun, actually did light tanks, so they mean a lot to me right now. But the production cost of a 1936 light tank is currently 9. So that's an increase of, quick maths, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, it's an increase of 4 IC per tank. For the tank destroyer, sorry, for the maths is hard, as you can see. It's a 13.2 increase on the tank destroyer comparative, so actually, oh, it's still the same. So it's a 4-point increase on the tank destroyer and a 3-point increase on the light tank itself. Sorry for getting my words jumbled up there. English is in fact a hard thing to do. We can also see that the stats are a bit different, but the main thing is this cost. And an increase of 4 points doesn't seem like a lot, but as a percentage of increase, it's actually fairly substantial. It's an increase of about 33%, almost, well, it's not quite a third, but it's as close to a third as you're going to get, really. Well, it's actually more. It's more than a third, isn't it? A third of 9 is 3, and therefore a 4-point increase is more than a third. If we take the same maths and apply it to, say, a 1939 medium tank, you're looking at a production cost of more like 12, maybe 16, 18 or so production points, or even 1941, about the same, quite a bit more. Heavy tanks, 27, apply a third onto that, you're looking at almost 40 IC per tank. And over the course of building 400 of these tanks for a 40 width division, or 200 or so for a 20 width, that's a lot more production, and that will really start to limit your number of divisions you can field with these new tanks. And I think we can see a bit more of that when we look here. 12 on this improved light tank, 26 on the new Balfarzug, 26, 25. It's a 1 point increase, doesn't quite add up, but it might just be really that bad, honestly. So yeah, so I think production cost is something that's going to be very important to look at. And in these sort of meme designs that QA broke, we can see 60, well, close to 70, 42, 7.6, interestingly, very cheap, but that's also a 1934 chassis. 76.7, that we're getting into the realms of the sort of big bulb super heavy sort of number, and if you're having to put 50 tanks in a battalion, that's pretty expensive. So I'll be curious to see how production cost works out and where the optimal number will come to. I imagine what you'll see is you will see a mixture of very light tanks for certain jobs and very expensive tanks for other jobs, which you will use fewer and further between. So on to thing number 2 now. So the second thing I would like to discuss is to do with, sorry if you heard that, there was a very loud motorbike going past, but the second thing I would like to discuss is where they're putting the gun techs. And there's a nice little spoiler here, the full list of gun techs that we can see. We can see what chassis they fit on, and we know that you can fit on a superstructure one chassis size above your existing one. So we know if you have a light tank chassis, you can fit a medium gun if you don't put it in a turret. But the interesting to see is that the guns unlock on the artillery techs. Now, why that is interesting is currently, unless you're doing a very specific niche role, like, say, Marines as Australia, or in certain mods, anti-tank as X country, you wouldn't do that in vanilla. Anti-tank's a bit useless in vanilla. Or, I don't know, mostly just artillery, to be honest. You only do them if you're actually making infantry divisions. If you're doing tanks, primarily, you will wait and research those that little bit later. Same with AA, typically you're only researching the first one to get the 75% cast damage reduction. And typically you don't research AT in vanilla, as you can't pierce heavy tanks with them. It's physically impossible to pierce a 40 tank heavy tank division with equivalent or even higher tier tech, especially if they up armor them. But now, as, say, Germany, and we will just tag switch over, rather than rushing down our armor tech tree and grabbing Panzer III, then Panzer IV for 1940, Panther in 1940 as well, you would get that by about April of 1940. This one in 1938, early part, and then in 37. You're going to not just have to research a chassis, you'll also have to research the gun you want to put on it. Now, let's say you want to make a fairly generic tank, you'll be looking to grab either artillery upgrade or AT upgrade. Now, we know that's the one after artillery 2. Now, I think that they're actually counting artillery 2 as this one, even though most people call it sort of, you know, RD2 and RD1, right? So RD2 is this one. So RD2 or AT upgrade. RD2 or AT upgrade. So you need the 1939 artillery tech. To get gun 2, which is presumably the one you're going to want to rush for your equivalent 1941 tank, you're actually going to need 19 artillery upgrade or AT upgrade. So that'll be this one or this one, I presume. It's the 1941 model, because you can see that there isn't actually a medium cannon 3. You sort of cap out at that point, you're sort of dunzoed. You have to then move on to high velocity 2 or something else, or fit it to a superstructure. It kind of pushes you quite a lot towards heavy cannon. I wonder if they just missed it off this list, because there is not a heavy cannon, a medium cannon 3. And the high velocity cannon 3 is heavy, and there doesn't really appear to be a equivalent good gun to put on your medium hull, other than just 1941 gun, frankly. And this might delay and also force you to research more varied stuff, which I personally quite like. And the main point I was going to make here was that a lot of the majors, especially say Germany for example, doesn't get any research boosts in its tech tree for artillery. It does get tank research bonuses, but no artillery research bonuses, and that's important because while they'll be happily able to rush the hull and the chassis or the armour, they won't be able to rush the guns to put on them. So historically, we'll see rather bad guns on rather nice tanks, but it does mean that for countries like South Africa, which in the meta obviously rush Heavy Tank 2 for the war, they might not be able to rush Heavy Tank 2 and put an equivalent good gun on it, but they do get an artillery research buff. So you might well see the Meta moving in the direction of they hard research AT1 and 2, and then get AT3, and instead use their 1 times 100% armor research bonus to go ahead and grab the 1941 light tank chassis and make themselves some good tank destroyers. And I think that will be a very interesting thing, personally. Sorry, just needed a mouthful of water there. So, I think overall this may well end up being a bit of a buff for miners, because you will start to see more specialised impact, rather than just South Africa does heavy tanks, Canada might do mediums, or Australia might do mediums. Hungary might do heavy tanks as well. Spain does mediums. What other tank countries are there? New Zealand does light tanks, I guess. You might start seeing, well, South Africa, you're going to be making me a light tank with a medium high velocity gun on it by making it a fixed TD. And that will delete German tanks in North Africa. Canada, I want you to concentrate on doing, let's say, for argument's sake, medium tanks with the medium cannon. Australia, we want you to do a medium tank, but we want you to put a howitzer on it and do a self-propelled gun type job. And that's quite an interesting thought, that we might see more specialised tanks rather than just generic, get the latest tank you can do in your focus tree, build a couple of those, and charge them LLMA repeatedly. So, let's move on to thing 3. So, the third thing I'd like to discuss, and this is a little bit of a smaller mention really, and something they put in the text, is that they're aiming to do away with the binary armor system, and it's mentioned here. We'll be making changes to reliability and armor. Details will be forthcoming. The armor system will become less binary. Now that is really, really interesting, and it relates to the stats. You can see here that the improved light tank does 18 armor and has 30 piercing. This TD, 18 armor, 50 piercing. The meme vehicles down below, you've got sort of 60, 332, 60, 44, 10, 161, 210, 13.6. So it's quite interesting that there's much more variation between your piercing number and your armor number, and if these tanks are broken, other than the fact that this one only goes backwards and that this one doesn't move at all, and that this one goes really darn quick, but has 0% minus 1,000 million reliabilities, then it's entirely possible that just having the highest armor value not being the best option. It's also interesting that this icon here has changed, but we'll come back to that later, that this is attack and defense, and this has become something else because that's a sword and a shield. So I'm curious about that, frankly. But also, that was just something that I only just picked up on. If you look on a division design at the moment, not a great example, sword, shield. So I wonder what the ... is. That's quite interesting. Anyway, I wonder if that's doctrine, because that will be the fourth thing I plan on discussing. But yeah, it's quite interesting that if stats become less binary, you'll definitely see a move away from heavy tanks and a move probably towards mediums, and I personally expect we will see this as an actual way to make light tanks useful, especially if armor and piercing isn't binary. Making a light tank TD or a light tank SPG that is cheap, cheerful, and gets the job done will effectively be a useful endeavor rather than something you do just to meme your opponent. So let's crack on and talk about thing number 4. So thing number 4, and the next thing I want to talk about is the variant on the mechanized, because I think this is really, really interesting as well. If we take a look at how variants work currently, I won't show it this way. I will show it using this here from the wiki. If you increase, say, armor, you get a 5% increase per time you press the button, 4% for speed on engine, 2% if it's an armoured car, so on and so forth. We don't have a production one at the moment in the game, but if anything's to go by, it may well be 10% or 5% most likely, I would imagine. If it's a 5% cost reduction at max level, then your mechanized goes from 8 production cost minus 25%, gives you 6 production cost. That's a huge difference in the production cost of a mechanized. And equally, if you're adding on 5% armor, what is the armor value of a bog standard level 1 mechanized? It's 10. 5% armor, 10 plus 25%, you get 12.5 armor. It's small, but if piercing is no longer binary, that's quite important. Speaking of piercing not being binary, piercing on infantry equipment suddenly became good, as did anti-tank. Now, I just think it'll be very interesting to maybe see more mechanized other than just as Canada doing it or as the accompaniment to tank divisions for certain nations that can afford it. But even so, most of the time, motorized just for cost efficiency purposes is generally better. Anyway, on to thing 5 and possibly the big reveal, the one that... So here we go, the big reveal, thing 5, and we're going to look at this picture. We're not going to draw attention to the fact that the 1934 medium has moved here, but something everybody is missing from this picture. The Land Doctrine tab. The tech tab icons have been condensed and pushed to the left. We can see artillery, we can see boats, we can see planes, we can see electronics and industry, we can see tanks. We can therefore presume that this is infantry. Now, I'm making that call based on the fact that we see this picture. And if you go to the armor tree, you see this picture in much the same place. And if we scroll up to the top, there's that aerial, so that picture has been moved over. There's that tank. So this picture has currently been shunted up. But we can draw dimensions from this point. That aerial's there, and the tip of this is directly underneath here, right? But, and this is kind of a but, that means that's been pulled up to here, and is also just to the left of the armor icon. So these have all been pulled this way. This picture is slightly more offset. To get that to line up with that, then these have all moved over, and Land Doctrine has in fact been taken out. These have all moved over, and this picture has shunted up like that to get that to line up there, like it is currently, and to get this to line up here. And that's interesting because of the new button that we saw, the magical cap, and it was revealed in this dev diary behind this point here, and in the Malta teaser dev diary, that there's the new magic cap icon. We also know that XP has moved over here, and that sits roughly in the theatre icon section of the screen up here. Now, I posited that it was going to be a new theatre command system. I think I'm wrong. I actively think now that it's going to be more like a high command option, and that your land doctrines, air doctrines and navy doctrines are some sort of new system. Now, that's really interesting, because if they've moved land doctrines off technology, that frees up so much tech for miners that it's a huge buff and hugely interesting. I just worry about what cost you'll have to pay to upgrade your doctrines, but if doctrines are now much more freeform and less of a tech tree, I think that is really, really interesting. And I can't wait to find out more. So please, do tell me what you think down below. Do you think they've scrapped land doctrines and now it's not a tech-based system? Do you like the tank designer? What sort of tanks are you going to make? And also, if you did like this video, please do like it. If you want to comment about it, then say something downstairs in the chat. And if you really, really enjoyed it, ring the bell, subscribe, and I'll see you next week when we talk about whatever brave new mechanic he mentioned. I say he, I mean, of course, Podcat, that he mentioned here, where he said that he would be discussing some sort of new mechanic in the next dev diary. So, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Ta-ra for now.